When God created the world and people, He intended us to be in right relationship with Him and with one another. The means by which we were to be in right relationship was that we had His life within us. And God's life was to provide all that we needed, and we were to be satisfied in Him. But when sin entered the world, all men died, and we're born with dead spirits because we're cut off from the life of God. Now, not only are we cut off from God by our sin, but we're cut off from one another. Because in place of God's life, we have nothing but our own resources and our own attempts to have life on our own. It's often said that people are sinners because they sin. But really, we sin because we were created for God's life and we don't have it within us. And so we become grabbers, trying to depend on ourselves to make life work. We do this in a lot of ways. We have sex outside of marriage. We depend on alcohol or drugs to numb out. We do good things like trying to be a good person and make ourselves feel better by helping the poor. We get religious and try and make ourselves measure up in the eyes of God. We depend on success or money or status. Anything we can to grab life, to make ourselves feel better inside. And if other people get in the way, or if other people are merely a means to obtain those things, that's okay, because we're number one and we're the most important. What all this equals is death and separation. Of course, we're already separated from God's life because of our sin. We're also separated from one another with broken relationships in this broken world. There's also been a lot of death in relationships as you see people isolated and separated because of choices they made and choices that people have made against them. And when everything ends, when we die, there's a physical death, and there's also an eternal separation from God in a literal place called hell, where we will experience a conscious punishment for our rejection of God and our desire to make life work on our own. This is not a pretty picture for our world today and for our future with God. But God loved all people too much to let it end like this. He knew that what we needed more than anything was His life back in our spirits. He knew that we didn't need to clean ourselves up or stop sinning, but really to have the life of God within us, and those things would take care of themselves. And so what God did first was send His Son Jesus Christ to earth. And Jesus lived a perfect life, never sinning. He depended perfectly on the life of God throughout His time on earth, and then He died on the cross. And His death on the cross paid for our sins. His death on the cross removed the barrier of sin and enabled God to give us His life. It did it because Jesus took the punishment that we deserved as He suffered on the cross. His death took the payment of death that we deserve for our sins. And then when He rose from the dead, His resurrection life became the life that all people can receive by believing in His name. So when we believe in Jesus and we receive His life, God puts His Spirit within us and restores us to right relationship with Himself. He also restores us to right relationship with other people by allowing us to love them. Instead of using them to get our needs met, we're able to love them because we have God's life and love within us. Now, if they're still separated from Christ, it's hard for them to return that love. They're still forced to depend on themselves for life. But when they receive Jesus, they're free to reciprocate that love through the life of God in their spirit. And so what we see is because the life of Jesus has come into the world and into our lives, death and separation are taken care of. Relationships are healed. We're not separated from one another by these barriers of grabbing life for ourselves. We're not separated from God's life by our sin. And instead, we're free to live in peace with one another and in peace with God. And one day we'll spend eternity in God's presence, in the presence of perfect joy and love. Now, it's not enough for us to kind of know about Jesus or believe He was a good man. But really what we must acknowledge is that Jesus alone is life, and that apart from Him, we are dead in our spirits, and that we need Him to give us His life that He gives freely through the cross, that we might become new creations. And when we believe that, God begins to change us from the inside out. As we live in the truth of who we are as God's children with His life within us, our behaviors and our thoughts should begin to change. And so instead of us trying to clean up our act and eliminate our sin from the outside in, God makes us new in our spirits. and we begin to change from the inside out. And that creates life and unity between people and between us and God. And that extends for all of eternity.